maybe we can start out and just tell me a little bit about you and how you got into socialism and capitalism and how you ended up writing Vulture Capitalism.
Sure. So I am Grace Blakeley. I'm a writer and activist. And I started out, I guess, my career as working for a think tank. So basically kind of researching problems with the UK economy and helping to kind of develop policies that we could then kind of pitch to political parties. And I worked, for a think tank on the kind of left of the political spectrum, and we produced lots of kind of thought leadership on the British economy and how to fix those structural problems, and then worked with the Labour Party under Corbyn to try and get some of that kind of put into policy, put into practice. And it was at that time that I was also at the same time kind of quite involved in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. I was doing much more kind of media and TV, basically like the BBC and various other news shows that have this commitment to kind of balance, were like freaking out because the entire commentariat and political establishment all hated Corbyn. So they needed to find these new voices that would be willing to kind of defend his policies. And I was the one who was kind of wheeled out to defend the kind of anti-austerity economics, which ended up kind of catapulting me into the public eye much more quickly than I otherwise would have been. And that was after that point, that was when I started writing more for myself, started writing books, ended up writing for a kind of left of centre political magazine called The New Statesman. Then started writing Vulture Capitalism. And during that period, I actually ended up moving down from London to Cornwall, which is where I am now. So I can kind of write and exist in peace apart from the horrors of the kind of British commentariat and political circles in Westminster, which after having spent my 20s in that world, I now find basically impossible to deal with. That's me basically.
Cool. And so the thesis of the book, let me hear your just, your elevator pitch on it so people get it.
Yeah, so we were just talking about COVID. I mean, the idea for the book really came out during COVID. As I often do during moments of crisis, went back to this guy, to Marx, and started rereading Capital. And I got to a point in that book where Marx talked about the kind of concentration and centralization of capital and how that tends to happen during moments of crisis. Basically, that just means, a smaller number of much larger and more powerful corporations. And it was very obvious that was going to be one result of COVID, was kind of greater centralization of the economy, both in terms of economics, in terms of corporations, and also in terms of politics, because the state was once again going to step in to ride to the rescue of capitalists. And the idea for the book really came out as I was doing the rounds of kind of breakfast TV shows and kept getting asked by, great minds like Piers Morgan questions like, well, the government's going to step in and, provide lots of cash to corporations and bail out workers and do all this stuff. Doesn't that mean that we basically have socialism? It's almost like Jeremy Corbyn won the 2019 election. And it was whilst doing all those interviews and having read what I'd read of Marx that I realized there were these profound misunderstandings that were very widespread about what capitalism is and relatedly what socialism is. People seem to think that capitalism was this kind of nice free market decentralized system of lots of small businesses competing with one another, and that those kind of market interactions were entirely separate from what went on within the state. And a real capitalist society is one with a free market and a small state. And if you look at all actually existing capitalist societies, they have highly concentrated unfree markets and very big powerful states that are willing to step in to support the interests of big business. So that's basically what the book is about. It's about how capitalism is not a free market system, how there is a fusion of economic and political power in service of vested interests at the top of society. It's a Marxist interpretation, so it looks at how the power relations within capitalist societies work at the level of the corporation, where you have this divide between owners and workers, at the level of the state, where basically you see politicians consistently intervening to prop up the interests of those capitalists, and how that looks at the international level as well. So when it comes to imperialism. And then at the end, I kind of chart the way out of this and show that if capitalism is this system of basically kind of like centralized oligarchy of businesses, politicians, financial institutions all working together to consolidate their wealth and privilege, then socialism doesn't mean like a big powerful state because the politicians are in bed with the bankers and the bosses. It instead means the kind of redistribution and decentralization of power. So like pulling power back down from those elites to ordinary people. And so I look at how that is happening right now.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I mean, just I was looking at the book again this morning, and feeling into it. I mean, obviously, we have a very, very extreme circumstance going on in the U.S., and yeah, I mean, I think the desired outcome I share with you would be redistribution of power. To some extent, redistribution of financial resources, maybe to a great extent. And I appreciated that you were being tactical and trying to sort of like look at examples of where that's occurred and how that could occur. Of course, I mean, it's hard not to be a little pessimistic at the moment, in terms of what's happening around the world. It just feels that these kind of transnational, mafioso oligarchy has really, hit its stride, and they've all kind of like found each other, and they've kind of like determined, kind of what the model is for the future. And also, they very much think that with artificial intelligence and drones and robots, it's soon going to be an offer that we can't possibly refuse. We just don't have the ability to refuse it. So I'm very curious, because I think we're in this actually very like crucial few year period where maybe there's still a way out from this thing. So I'm very curious just to maybe go into that, like, with you, like, where we're at now, and from a leftist perspective, kind of like a perspective that wants human freedom and socialism and true democracy and so on. What can we actually do at this point? And I know England and America are slightly different situations, although have a lot of similarities and resonances. So yeah, that's like my big question or my big thought around the situation. So I've been doing a lot of researching into the sort of tech oligarchs and how kind of like because a lot of these guys were like Obama Democrats, and they suddenly, for a whole host of reasons, got pulled to the right and ended up. I mean, Peter Thiel was obviously like the bellwether, and then all of them have now joined forces, with this sort of fascist, unfortunately, kind of regime. So anyway, yeah, I don't know if you want to reflect on any of that, or I can.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what you were saying about how this is like it's hard to feel hopeful during this moment. I think depending on your understanding of how capitalism works, it's easy to overestimate the novelty of what we're seeing right now. And actually, I wrote Vulture Capitalism. It came out last year before this stuff had happened. And the whole argument of the book is that the nature of capitalism is that corporate, financial, and political elites work together to secure their own wealth and privilege. That oligarchy and capitalism basically go hand in hand. And you can track that all the way back to the very origins of the system with the East India Company, this like joint venture between the British state and a bunch of merchants with the aim of colonizing the Indian subcontinent, all the way through to, I look at I track the evolution of the Ford Motor Company, which is supposed to be this kind of brilliant capitalist enterprise. And Ford is this kind of, free marketeer. And I show the deep interrelationships between Ford and the American state. And how the American state really supported Ford in basically waging war against his workers to consolidate his own power. I also think there's a very interesting parallel there because Ford was a fascist. He was a vehement anti-Semite. He was mentioned positively by Hitler in Mein Kampf as like a good guy. And a lot of that came from not only his kind of weird interpretation of Christianity, but also his like absolute hatred of unions and the idea that if anyone stood up to his power and his authority, that was the worst possible thing they could do because it would mean disorder and chaos. And you see echoes of that kind of thinking, I think, today across the alt-right, but particularly in Elon Musk, who's obviously also makes cars, also has very close links with the American state, also quasi kind of fascist who hates unions and has gone to war with his labor movement. So again, very clear historical parallels there. And I also think, another interesting example is, who did Donald Trump make Secretary of State in his first term? Rex Tillerson, this former CEO of ExxonMobil, a company that knew about climate breakdown in the 1970s and so took funding out of its climate research team and redirected it into climate denialism. Like, all of this stuff has been happening for a very long time. It's just become much more obvious and much clearer, partly because the people whose interests are now being disrupted are people whose interests haven't up to now been as disrupted by these patterns. So if we're thinking about the kind of technological shifts, then it's mainly kind of middle income office workers who are seeing these shifts affect them right now. When we're thinking about Trump's trade war, then, it's everyone really in the economy who's being affected by that, but it is having a significant impact on, for example, people's pension wealth and their stock portfolios. And it's obviously kind of taking aim at the free trade, and I use that term loosely, consensus that's dominated the mainstream media and, liberal. And I use liberal in the British sense, by the way, which just means kind of like moderate thought across the Republicans and the Democrats for a very long time. So people are now suddenly being like, oh, wow, this horrible oligarchy is happening and it's coming to take my stuff. But actually, if you look at capitalism in a clear-eyed way, you can see that this is always how this system has worked. It's just becoming obvious because we're in this moment of really profound crisis for a lot of different reasons, whether you're looking at that in economic terms, in terms of growth and productivity, whether you're looking at it in terms of climate and ecology, whether you're looking at it in terms of kind of the trust and faith in democracy and that being eroded by rising inequality. All these crises kind of coming together to expose the weaknesses and limitations of the system that is supposed to govern our interactions with each other, whether those interactions are economic, political, or social, or whatever. People are basically suddenly starting to realize that capitalism is corrupt and doesn't have the interests of the majority at, our leaders don't have the interests of the majority at heart. And that if we don't do something about it, the system will bring us down, our societies down, our planet down, and all of the things we value down with it. I think it's important not to overestimate the novelty of this moment, to recognize that these trends are kind of integral to the way that this system works, and to take faith and hope from people throughout history who have also experienced this kind of corruption, this kind of oligarchy, and worked together to fight back against it. Because those people, let's say, the earliest unionists who were working to build power in the context of not having the vote, in the context of a brutal industrial system that was resulting in them dying at very early ages, without much education, without really a kind of historical tradition of unionism to draw on, they had to do it, and they did. And that's why we have in the UK socialized healthcare. It's why you got the New Deal and why we got limitations on working time. People have been fighting this system since its origins. The history of capitalism, the history of the world is the history of class struggle. This has always been the case. I just think that now we're hearing a lot more about it because it has become quite clear that the way that we organize our society right now benefits almost nobody except those at the very, very top.
Thank you. I mean, I agree with you that the resonances with, past historical moments are really obvious and extraordinary. And there's certainly a continuation of a struggle. I mean, obviously the resonances between what's happening in the US right now and the rise of Nazi Germany, which they're, intentionally seem to be kind of like going for, whether it's like Musk and Steve Bannon, two of Trump's closest advisors, making open Nazi salutes, or the, Nazi kind of dog whistles in the Doge logo, or the tariffs, which was a playbook that Hitler used to kind of, which ended up, kind of like he would try to get an autarky in Germany in the 30s. And ultimately that led to so much, frustration and deprivation, that then led to the wars of territorial conquest as like the only way out of that, like just grab other people's resources. And similarly, we're now starting to talk about invading like Greenland and Canada and Mexico. So yeah, there's a lot of resonance with not. I mean, unfortunately, when you go back to the Nazi era, the Nazis. So, I mean, I guess fascism has a tendency to sort of exhaust itself, or maybe the leader dies and then there's a vacuum or something. But often it doesn't really stop until it has created like a massive destructive kind of like outcome for the people who were behind it. And in the 40s, that destruction ultimately came from America, which was able to come in and finally fight back against Germany and build this huge engine to defeat that. We don't really have another America waiting in the wings right now. So as America tilts more towards this kind of like fascism, it becomes more difficult, to see if it's not something within the system, that can change the dynamics, how that could happen. But sure, I mean, yes, I mean, to me, I guess one question I had, which I've always had, and reading your book just brings it up again, is why is it so difficult? I mean, considering we have all these communication tools, why is it so much easier for these oligarchic forces of destruction to coordinate and cooperate? Whereas the left, the workers, the liberals, the empathic people seem to. I mean, it's nice you have all these little examples, like you have the Porto Alegre example, the that what was that? There was that car company or that you talked about. Yeah, there's nice little examples of people taking over companies and socializing.
Yeah.
But these generally, you know, remain as these sort of isolated. Like it sort of feels like if the democratic socialist alternative was meant to kind of like evolve beyond the destructive oligarchic fascist paradigm, it would have done that, and instead it sort of feels like the oligarchic technocratic destructive paradigm over time is, and I hope it's not the case. I'm all for this other alternative, but I think we have to get very, 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 very real right now about why that hasn't happened. And there's a little bit of those of us who have empathy for the human condition and care about, like, where there's a little bit of, I don't know if it's naivete or something, but there's something about it which is like where we don't seem to, I mean, we have little wins, but we have these big losses right now. That's just trying to express. I don't know if I perfectly expressed that, but maybe you understand.
Yeah, no, I do. And I think basically that the answer to your question as to why this system is growing in strength rather than being defeated. It's something I've just started reading your book, which you sent over, and you kind of you allude a little bit to this, I think, in the introduction to that book, which is the problem of individualism and the way that breeds frustration in response to powerlessness. I mean, this is something that I highlight a bit in this book, but it's actually going to be the subject of my next book. Basically, powerlessness is the defining political emotion of the 21st century. Why? Well, because of all the reasons I've just highlighted. We live in this kind of corrupt oligarchy in which the mechanisms that historically people have used to demand accountability, whether those be kind of democratic or other forms of collective power and collective organizing, they've also been beaten back. So you confront this kind of all-encompassing what seems like completely coherent system, which fuses political and economic power in service of the interests of this ruling class, basically. And you think, well, I'm not part of the ruling class. I don't have, as just one individual, any way to make Elon Musk or Donald Trump pay attention to me or my interests. And there are basically two responses to that knowledge. That knowledge that you as one single isolated individual cannot fight back against these organized forces of capital, basically. And there's despair or rage. I think a lot of people on the left fall into the trap of despair, which is basically to say there's nothing I on my own can do to confront this system. And often they've started way back by thinking, I'm outraged by what's going on in the world. I want to do something to change it. So I'm going to try and vote for this political party. I'm going to change my consumption habits. I'm going to do all these little individual actions that I feel maybe will shift the way that the system works. And that doesn't work. And they start feeling a sense of despair and hopelessness about the future. The other response is rage. And this tends to be something that mobilizes people on the right. And generally, this also is more likely to come from men because there's a sense of, I feel powerless. And you as a man are not supposed to feel powerless. You are supposed to have control over your world, the circumstances in which you live and exist. You're supposed to be able to have a sense of agency and power to influence the world around you. And of course, the world that we live in today is one in which the vast majority of decisions are taken by people, with zero accountability. So, you're offered the illusion of choice, but really the options that you're choosing from, that is a set of decisions that's already been made by someone else. So you lose this sense of agency. You become overcome by the sense of powerlessness. And for some people, the only response to that is just rage. And it's a kind of, it's often that kind of blind rage, which means that, you're very willing to vote for a political party or support a political movement that is almost entirely destructive in its outlook, because you can project your sense of political agency onto someone like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen or whoever else who seems strong, who seems powerful, who's going to give you back that sense of power and control and agency so that you feel like you have the capacity to kind of take on the system. And it's really like one of those fascinating examples of how the far right is able to exploit the contradictions and problems created by capitalism. We live in an oligarchic capitalist system, so that makes you feel powerless. And then in comes the right and says, rather than challenging the fundamental relationships and social structures that underpin that system, we're going to give you a sense of power back, a kind of simulacra of power that makes you feel emboldened, but it's not actually going to change anything. And actually, the kind of parallel, the historical parallel that I like to think of most is fascism in Italy. Because Mussolini was a former socialist, and he knew very well the kind of sense of like joy and community and belonging and collective power that can come when people organize. This is where he got the idea for the fasces, which became the symbol for fascism. This is a bundle of sticks wrapped together with an axe in the middle. It's a Roman weapon, and it's supposed to symbolize strength in numbers. And he is very clearly an allusion to the long-standing trade unionist tradition, which has as its symbol the raised fist. And the idea of that is that it's easy to break one finger, but you can't break a fist. This same thing is alluded to with the fasces, which is like you can break a single stick, but you can't break them when they're all bound together. And this was like Mussolini's response to the economic turmoil and social turmoil that had engulfed Italy at the time, was to say we all need to band together to defend our nation, to defend our communities, to defend our country. And that's going to make you feel strong and powerful again. It's going to make you feel like you're part of something. And you see that happening all over the world today. You saw it happening in the UK with the violent riots that took place last summer, which was people standing up to defend their communities, again, about exerting that sense of strength and power. You see it with Trump. You saw it with the Capitol rioters. It's this kind of like, I'm going to take back what's mine. I'm going to take back my power, and that making you feel some sense of strength. And it all being an illusion, because ultimately you're still being repressed by the people who are literally running the country, like billionaires like Elon Musk and Donald Trump. So that's really why I think we haven't gotten anywhere. It's because people are so wrapped up in these like individualistic responses to powerlessness that we've not been able to get out of these traps of either despair or rage. Because, of course, the other alternative is to say, yes, those at the top are very powerful, but it's up to us to band together to defend ourselves, to protect ourselves, to survive, but also to resist and to take this fight forward. And that's always what the left has been about historically. I like to say that the left didn't emerge from like clever intellectuals coming into working class communities and saying, have you guys considered maybe forming a union to fight for higher wages? The left emerged out of people's struggles for a better life. It emerged because people were being exploited, oppressed, they felt powerless, and they came together through these communities that were in the past probably much easier to form. And they got that sense of collective power and strength through that organizing. And ultimately, they were able to transform the very nature of this system by doing so. And it's an ideological and a psychological shift that's required for us to be able to move through these like low-level reactions of despair and rage and towards a more constructive process of forming ourselves into communities that can resist.
Yeah, I have all sorts of different responses to that. I mean, um, yeah, I noticed you started the book with that Hayek quote where he's talking about basically how intellectual elites basically define society, and most people are just followers. And then, you counteracted that to say that actually following, I don't know, Marx, maybe that people are actually creative architects. They're just not really given that opportunity. And I do agree with you, but I also think Hayek has a point too, in that I'm not sure that most people actually have. I mean, I think that intellectual capacity is not something that's just like evenly distributed through society. Like, most people, are kind of happy just to go along. I mean, a number of people recently have been talking about this sort of thing about how there's like 10% of people in a society are inherently, kind of empathic and care about other people. 10% are more inherently like, sociopathic and only care about their own interests and their own ends. Then everybody else is kind of like in the middle and will go in either direction depending on, what's being offered to them. I don't know if that has resonance to you at all, but it just feels like that's kind of like what my when I look at my life experience, there's always this thing about what we would want to be the case and what actually is the case. And
Well, I guess I take the view that what actually is the case is in large part socially constructed. So
I agree with
your
that too.
intelligence, your intelligence or the intelligence of a social group or the capabilities of a social group are shaped by the kind of society in which they live. And I think that living in an individualistic society encourages this ordering of human beings based on their allegedly kind of innate capabilities, because the view is society is a big market, right? And we're all competing against one another to display our inherent worth. And those who end up at the top, the elites, get to the top because they're just better than everyone else. And those who are at the bottom are at the bottom because they're just inherently inferior. And, that is the kind of way of looking at the world that was really encouraged by neoliberalism, basically, which was projecting this metaphor of the market onto every area of social life. I'm reading a really fascinating book at the moment now, actually, called Hayek's Bastards by Quinn Slobodian, which looks at how the neoliberals, who were initially kind of really just focused on economics, a strand of thought within that movement ended up merging with a much more kind of regressive cultural conservative tradition to form the kind of paleo conservative / alt-right movement, which was to say society as a market. And, there are innate differences between human beings. And some of them said between races when it comes to IQ, when it comes to, their general capabilities, and that we need to recognize and actually help to reinforce those kind of in unequal structures so that our countries get the good, smart, intelligent people, and all the worthless people are kind of shoved into little enclaves where they can be exploited. And that kind of vision of like this hierarchical society in which the market sorts the good from the bad, I think that's actually like disempowering us so much, because basically those at the top think, well, I don't have to be kind because I'm here because I deserve it. And those at the bottom think, well, I can't fight back because I'm just stupid. That's why I don't earn very much money. And actually, when you see that the system is rigged so that those at the top end up at the top basically through corruption or cronyism or whatever you want to call it, and those at the bottom end up at the bottom through largely exploitation and oppression or inherited trauma or like whatever else has gone into making them the types of people that they are, then I think you can start to break those thought patterns that leave you trapped and leave you thinking that, oh yeah, this social order is legitimate because it just sorts the good from the bad.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a racist, eugenic, apartheid undercurrent under what's happening in the U.S. right now, and that's also something that we find in the sort of tech billionaire class, like David Sachs, Thiel, Musk, who all grew up in apartheid South Africa, and Curtis Yarvin, who has become kind of like the philosopher for Thiel and JD Vance.
Mm.
He's openly joked about, maybe the useless underclass could be turned into biodiesel for the buses. And he's also talked about, kind of like racial differences in IQ and that some races are naturally more predisposed to be slaves and all that stuff. So, they're completely working with all of those ideas, which, do have a very powerful grip on this you know, sort of collective demonic aspects of the unconscious. Um, and yeah, I mean, what do you think about, do you think that the left, in a way, has made a historical mistake around being, kind of too pro-immigration at this point? I mean, like, people are pointing to Denmark as, one of the few places where a leftist government has managed to thrive, partially because they took a very harsh anti-immigration thing. And for me, I grew up in New York City. I've always liked a multicultural
Mm.
society. I think I don't see any particularly special great thing about like the white race or whatever. It's just not my shtick. But it is the case that 1965 with the Immigration Act, like there were 13% non-white people in the U.S. and now it's like 45% or something. So I could see that if it was something that you had this kind of unconscious, instinctive kind of bias around, you would begin to feel that the liberals are about to replace the white majority with people who are more going to be more on their side and want to redistribute wealth and take all the goodies away from the white people and so on. So yeah, I mean, do you think that the left has made a historic mistake around immigration, and actually there needs to be and I don't even know how we can get to that next, but I'll throw that question out to you. And how do you feel that has to be dealt with?
Yeah,
We're
I think
gonna,
what's really interesting is that the places that have the most virulent views on migration are the places with the least migration, which suggests that this is less an issue that relates to the actual influx of people into places and much more about a psychological response that is being stoked by particular sorts of people. Before we get to the question of like what level of immigration should we have, which is a policy question that needs to be decided based on a number of different factors, we should really be asking why at a moment of extraordinary inequality, political corruption, ecological violence, just constant crisis, immigration is the biggest thing that we're talking about. Why is that? Because it benefits those at the top for us to be talking about that issue rather than talking about all of the other issues that affect our lives. And it's worked really, really effectively. If you think about that kind of intellectual movement that emerged out of neoliberalism and then became the far right, their concern was that demands for kind of collective power and for social justice would basically sneak in through the back door as people became aware of issues like climate breakdown, as inequality became much more pronounced, and as various different social groups made demands for equal rights. They were basically concerned that even though the neoliberals had after 1989 basically won the battle, they might lose this longer term war because of the language of social justice, and they needed to find a way to kind of fight back against that. So this kind of appeal to the idea of an innate hierarchy of human beings and the idea that the weak were kind of coming for the strong is what they pushed. And it's been really effective. So, the idea that like women are coming for men's privileges, migrants and the non-white population are coming for the privileges of white people, really is effective in displacing people's anger from of anti-elitist anger to a kind of interpersonal anger that focuses rage on groups that are much more targetable. And this, I think, is why this move actually works, right? Because if we go back to this question about people feel powerless, their lives are getting worse, they don't feel like there's anything they can do about it, they confront this, very pervasive elite that kind of rules every area of their lives. How do you respond to that powerlessness if you genuinely feel like you are alone and there's nothing you can do to take on the billionaire class. You still need to feel like you have some agency. So again, going back to that example of Mussolini's Italy and fascism, you can take out that if you think the enemy is those at the top, you feel powerless. If you think the enemy is someone who lives next door, or someone down the road in your community, or someone who's weaker than you, it makes you feel powerful. And that is historically the foundation of fascism. It is redirecting people's rage at their own exploitation and oppression onto groups kind of lower down the food chain than them. And it creates these kind of powerful social movements that completely avoid talking about issues of class and economics, and instead mobilize that rage at people's disempowerment against social groups that are less powerful. And that's basically what I think we're seeing going on right now. If you look at Denmark, okay, so the Danish example is very interesting. I was in Denmark not that long ago, and their left government is basically like the Democrats in the US or Starmer here. That they've done very little in terms of, progressive economic policy. They've done some regressive things. They have done one or two good things on climate, which does differentiate them from those other kind of red-brown parties in other parts of Europe, but they're not particularly progressive. And if you look at another parallel, which was the Social Democrats in the Netherlands, they also tried to pursue this strategy of kind of like middle of the road, not too kind of right-wing economics alongside regressive policies on migration. That ended up just paving the way for the rise of the far right and Geert Wilders and the Freedom Party, basically because on the economic side, those parties did not answer any of the issues that people are facing around living standards, around inequality, around the corruption of democracy. And at the same time, they fed into this very appealing narrative that the right has been pushing, which is you're poor because of these people who are poorer than you, and you should blame migrants and you should blame benefit scroungers and all those sorts of things. And when those narratives are pushed and become embedded, that only benefits the far right. We see it today in the UK. People like Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, they're really concerned about the rise of reform because Starmer has again pursued basically a continuation of the economic policy of the Conservatives. It's making inequality worse. It's making, public services aren't functioning very effectively. Growth doesn't look like it's going to recover. We're going to go into a recession. And that is why people start looking at reform, because they're like, you promised our lives would get better and it hasn't gotten better. And so Keir Starmer answers that rather than by saying, okay, we're going to change the economy, by saying, no, you're right. Reform is correct on migration, and we're actually going to be tough on migration. But as soon as you say reform is correct on migration, people aren't going to vote for Labour. People are going to vote for reform. So it's really about, what are the cleavages that are most pronounced at a particular, historical moment, and why. And, I wouldn't say that today the reason that we're having all of these debates about migration is that migration has become unsustainable. If you look at the communities in which people are most aggrieved about this, they don't have very much migration because they don't have many jobs. So the migrants don't move there. But they are really pissed off about feeling powerlessness and wanting to have someone to blame. And when our political class reinforces that, it actually undermines their own base. And that's what I think's been happening.
I completely agree. But I also feel that I guess there's like the ideal and the real, right? So it's like now we're stuck with all these people who have been, pulled deep into this sort of bias psychology. And that's also where, I guess I feel a little bit, kind of like overwhelmed. I mean, it feels like, 2015 ish, there was sort of a balance of like, blue and red media. I'm not even a Democrat. I'm a, Murray Bookchin, like social ecologist, anarchist, social ecologist. But I mean, no, somehow the balance between, kind of the media system began to move more towards the red. And so now in the US, there's like an overwhelming dominance of, reactionary right-wing media, and it's just pulling more and more in that direction. And so you have people who are very conditioned, and even people who are smart and have like decent values, they also start to get off center because it's Joe Rogan or it's Candace Owen or like Russell Brand or like, even the RFK Maha kind of yoga spiritual pipeline. It's like, I mean, it becomes harder and harder for me to envision when people have been sucked into all of these manipulations how we get people back into sanity. So that's where I'm kind of curious. Yeah, like beyond the pointing to solutions like Porto Alegre and look how nice we're. What can we actually do now? Like here we have we have 330 for people. They say we probably have more like 200. Some people signed off. What would you tell all these people? Tell me? Like what do I do right now? I mean, I have ideas which I can share with you.
Yeah,
But
I
like,
would love. I would love to know
I
your.
don't, I'm not a steel worker. I'm not going to be part of a union. I'm a freelance writer, self-employed. I always feel, and I do feel sort of alienated from society. A lot of the, anyway. So yeah, what do we do with all the people? Because people they want to get involved. They don't know what to do.
I just finished reading a great book, which I would really encourage everyone to read, called "Don't Talk About Politics," and it
Yeah,
basically shows that any form of political debate, it doesn't change people's minds. That
yeah,
you don't change people's minds on politics by having a kind of rational debate about ideas. You can change people's minds about scientific principles by explaining the facts to them, but people's politics are too tied to their sense of identity to really be shifted through debate. And there's some really fascinating studies, like she studies the history of like TV debates and how like a vanishingly tiny percentage of voters change their vote on the basis of those debates. The only real impact it has is that if the debate goes badly for your candidate, your voters were much less likely to actually show up. So this like culture we have around politics of being like, oh, we need to convince people of our perspective by showing them the arguments is like precisely the wrong way to go. The kind of stuff that I do and that you do and a lot of kind of commentators do, I think has to be about like mobilizing people and engaging the base, engaging people to do what? To go and talk to people. She also shows that the only way people actually changed their mind was by having open and honest conversations with people that they trust. We live in an extremely fractured society where trust is eroding across a whole number of different metrics: trust in our political institutions and cultural institutions, trust in each other. For obvious reasons, individualism is just one of those. And so those relationships that people do have that are based on trust are really important. And we need to figure out how to deepen and broaden and expand them. And that basically means we all, as leftists, need to be having conversations with people. We need to be showing up at meetings. We need to be showing up in our communities. We need to be, forming collectives where we can actually talk to people and start to build that trust that is the foundation for really like political transformation. And it's not just that it's the foundation for kind of changing people's minds. It's that all of these things I've been talking about, the despair, the rage, they all stem from feeling as though you're confronting a powerful system on your own. Historically, when people have been much more rooted in these kinds of collectives and communities, they haven't felt they've been confronting the same sorts of concentrated forms of power, but because they haven't felt like they were confronting those things on their own, they've instead been like, right, okay, well, we're a group, we're a community. What can we do to protect ourselves? And once they've done figuring out how to protect themselves, they then think, right, well, how can we protect those around us? How can we start resisting this system because it's fundamentally unjust? And that sense of like collective power comes from going out and talking to people and realizing, oh shit, everyone else realizes this system is fucked and they want to do something about it as well. When you're just sat at home on your phone arguing with people on the right on Twitter, you think, oh, how is everyone else so evil and so wrong? And I'm the only person who understands this. And like, I'm just completely alone, right? So it really is about getting out there in person, talking to people, building collective power. I know that your next question is going to be, how do you do this? And to be honest, I think there are loads of different ways. I write on my Substack a weekly column called What Can We Do?, where I interview organizers from all over the world doing very different things about their approach to organizing. So I interviewed someone last week who was talking about organizing federal workers to resist Trump and Musk and forming a union for federal workers that's actually militant and can bring people out onto the streets. Before that, I spoke to students in Serbia who are protesting against their government, against corruption, and basically bringing down the nation state, well, bringing down the government and bringing their nation to a halt. And I've spoken to union organizers who are, just on like small scale campaigns to fight back against like, exploitative employers. I've spoken to people doing trade union political education, so like engaging workers in conversations about capitalism and class struggle. I've spoken to climate organizers, or, from everyone, like from, Just Stop Oil going out into the streets all the way through to the groups that are trying to target MPs to say, write to your MP about, changing this particular piece of political legislation. There are such different and various ways of getting involved in these sorts of movements. And like, I'm almost 100% sure that anyone watching this call will have a route in. Like, I'm also a writer who sits at home by myself. Well, actually, I go to a co-working space because I don't really like being by myself, but generally I'm pretty
I
isolated.
go to cafes.
Yeah, exactly. So I've joined my union, the Society of Authors, and I'm working with a bunch of other writers to transform that organization into an actual union rather than kind of middle class bourgeois institution that can represent us. And that's been a really exciting campaign to be involved in. I live in Cornwall, in a small town by the sea. There's not a lot of political activism going on here, but I still put events on. I still, am a trustee of my food bank and go out and speak to people on the streets about the problems that they're facing. There's so many different things that you can do that will get you engaged with other humans. And it doesn't even have to be explicitly political if you're worried about that. Just taking the first step of getting out of our little tiny bubbles and just being in the world, being in our suffering, in our grief, in our fear, and our despair with other people, and realizing that we're all in it together and we all want a way out.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. I mean, I've been involved with different movements to some extent, like Occupy Wall Street. And then I actually was organizing with kind of like millennial influencers who had large followings. We did a series of events in New York at the Bowery Hotel here. So I was working with Alexa Chung,
cool.
English fashion icon, and Zoe Kravitz, and Penn Badgley, who started the Gossip Girls, and so on.
That sounds amazing.
It was amazing. We did a few events, and we had a little bit of a groundswell, but then Penn, who was one of the main people involved, he was going to start giving us some money. He was like, "Oh, well, all I have to do is go to one event and wear a T-shirt. And I get like $30,000. I don't like doing it, but I'll just go to some events and wear these T-shirts, and I'll give our little group the money."
Yeah.
And then he ghosted on us, and I felt like a manager, somebody, or had warned him, not to keep doing this. Or Alexa Chung, had made some comment about maybe fashion isn't that important. And then she almost got, drummed out of the business and so on. So I feel
my gosh, yeah.
Well, I mean, I feel like these guys, if you're in the successful group, you get a lot of subtle inducements to toe the line.
100%.
And, as long as you stay in the, so anyway, so it just felt like there was a huge attempt back then to create this platform for social conversations. And again, with Extinction Rebellion, and somehow they kind of reach a certain point, and then they sort of disintegrate. I mean, another problem we have, I think, or we've had on the left, has been this kind of ideological purity test with cancellations and wokeism and so on. And I do think that has really limited the reach of the organization, of these organizations. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, again, I think a lot of this comes from basically like posters brain. It's like we are not just interacting with people in extremely hostile ways online. We are then taking those ways of interacting with people and applying them to real life. So, historically, if you were a unionist, say, and you were trying to form a campaign to organize your workplace, you would have encountered so many people with very different political views than you. Some of them would have been conservative. Some of them would have been, communists, right? And as part of that campaign, you would have had to learn how to speak to people with extremely different views to you and build them into a collective. And we've lost that because we've lost all these forms of collective organizing. We're basically just these kind of individualistic atoms who see politics as this process of, kind of forming our identities as humans, as individuals, rather than doing the actual real human thing of organizing ourselves into groups to not just like fight and kind of fight for justice and kind of really show up as powerful groups, but actually to create these senses of belonging and community that form the foundations of our capacity to listen to and understand other people. Because if you are working with other people in your community to say, stop your library from getting shut down, you're working with other people in your workplace to try and get union recognition, you have to move beyond, these are the boundaries of my identity, this is what my politics is, and I want you to recognize that, to how can we understand each other so that we can work on this issue together? How can we understand each other so we can build this movement that will ultimately meet both of our material interests, as well as creating a sense of solidarity and connection and belonging that is a fundamental need of all human beings, right? So I don't think that it's just like, people have suddenly become unhinged and evil and just obsessed with themselves. I think the fact of the decline of collective power, combined with our social isolation and our increasing use of just social media as a way of projecting our politics, has removed the need to listen and engage and form bonds with other people in the way that historically it was, imperative to do that to form any kind of political organization. And that's, I think, the problem. So again, if we want to fight back against that, there's no use, wagging our fingers and saying, you've used this language wrong, because it's the same as in reverse, right? If we say, well, the kind of wokeism has been the problem, and then we come back and say, well, you woke people are being too woke, we're just feeding into the same dynamic. We need to actually get out of these echo chambers and these divisive conversations and get out there and start working together to fight for the things that we need, to fight for our lives, our planet, our dignity, and work together, not just to kind of resist this system, but often just to be able to survive and get through what is going to be an extremely challenging phase of capitalism for the vast majority of people on the planet.
Yeah. Um, I agree with you. I still think, yeah, just speaking personally, and I think for a lot of people, it's like when you're in an atomized, hyper-individualized society where, like in terms of like, like even, I make a lot of my living on Substack. I used to write for magazines. Even there was a bit more of a cohesive, like everybody, there was like an ideology or whatever. So there's like the technology has this natural kind of atomizing tendency, and where your own interests are like made more your own private interests. But I do wonder if some of the resolution does actually require like social media and social technology. I don't know if have you looked into the work of Audrey Tang at all?
Yeah. So that was going to be it was one of the things that I looked at actually as a case study for the book, but didn't end up getting to include it because I didn't have time to those sorts of interviews. But I think it can be. Look at Barcelona. They have a platform called Decidim that facilitates kind of citizen engagement in policy making. A lot of the experiments in participatory budgeting have used these kind of have used various forms of digital media, less social media, but particular kinds of platforms to facilitate people's engagement in setting local budgets and stuff. With these technologies, I don't think that they are inherently antisocial. But I think our tendency to use them at the expense of all other forms of human interaction is obviously antisocial. And I do think it's easy to, to kind of confront the conditions that we're facing right now and to respond to the problem of atomization and individualism by just saying, well, I'm on my own. The only thing I can do is kind of hustle and be an entrepreneur of the self and try and boost my human capital and compete with everyone else around me to get to the top. But it's such a trap. The only way we're ever going to be able to really revive left politics, the only way we're going to be able to survive as individuals, let alone as collectives, is by getting out into our places, into our workplaces, into our communities, and forming the bonds that will be required to facilitate our own survival and allow us to resist this onslaught from the top down. And look, I'm not saying that it's going to be easy or even that it's going to work. It's just the only option that we have.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've never been in a situation in my life before where I'm starting to feel like unease or fear about expressing myself online. Um, and clearly they're terrorizing. They're full out trying to terrorize the population here, with grabbing kind of naturalized citizens or legal residents off the streets, for taking them to El Salvadoran concentration camps. I'm literally at the point now where like there's, I don't know if you've heard about the Abrego Garcia case here.
No.
He was a legal resident Venezuelan guy, married with an autistic 5-year-old kid, no legal record. So they grabbed him off the street a couple of weeks ago, and they took him to this El Salvadorian prison
Oh,
or
God.
concentration camp,
Yeah.
where there's no legal hearings. Uh-oh, did we lose you?
You see me? Oh, shit. Hang on.
You just
Sorry.
here for a second.
There we go. I'm back.
No due process. And basically nobody leaves this concentration camp except in a coffin.
Wow.
And, so they brought a few hundred people there now, and this guy is the most egregious because most of them are legal immigrants, which still obviously they deserve due process, and it's necessary they have that. So I'm kind of like personally at this point where like if they now the courts are putting a lot of pressure on Trump, but he's in a way at this point just kind of like avoiding the courts. And because he controls the executive branch, controls the marshals, the security, the army, and so on, the judiciary doesn't have its own enforcement form, so they can censure him or whatever, but they don't actually have any way to go and like put him in jail or whatever. So if it reaches that point where there's basically no longer a rule of law in the U.S., I'm going to leave the country. I think a lot of people will too. But I also feel
You're welcome in the UK.
What's that? What's that?
You're welcome in the UK, although, yeah, I'm not sure what direction we're headed in.
Yeah. I just, but I appreciate what you're saying. You're basically saying that there isn't really a choice at this point except to try to fight this thing. And then the question is, how do we do that most effectively?
Yeah.
Are there any organizations or groups where you're like, wow, what they're doing, the way they're organizing this thing? I mean, I think a lot about that movie, The Battle of Algiers. Did you ever see it?
No.
It's a great movie. It's about how the Islamic resistance in Algiers ultimately overthrew the French government through this kind of cell structure, which was highly decentralized, where nobody actually knew who was in control in any way. Yeah. But yeah, so
what would the organization be? I'm going to say this and then I'm going to have to go because I'm already late for my next thing.
No worries, all good.
But
thank you for making the time. I appreciate it.
No, not at all. I mean, obviously we've got loads more that we could probably go on for another hour, couldn't we? So we'll have to do it again.
I'm happy to do it again. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But in terms of organizations, there are some great tenants unions that I think if you are one of those people who is maybe like a bit atomized and isolated and is looking for a way to get involved in a kind of form of community organizing, tenants unions are really great. Things like Acorn, for example, or if Acorn is in the US and in the UK, there's also like the London Renters Union, those sorts of things. Obviously, if you are in a sector that you can unionize in, do try and form a union. You might be disappointed with the way your union is run, but that's just an extra impetus to kind of get involved and start having these conversations with people. And yeah, I would also say there will be people on this call right now who have issues that they are extremely passionate about, whether that is climate, whether it's the genocide in Gaza, whether it's, whatever. And there will be groups organizing in your local area on those issues with whom you can start organizing as well. It really is just a case of kind of, sticking your head above the parapet and saying, I want to find other people who are concerned about what feels like the end of the world.
Yeah, pretty much.
Even though it isn't.
We can't say for sure. Oh, the movie I mentioned was Battle of Algiers.
Yeah, okay, cool. I'll watch that. That sounds great. Thank you.
Pretty cool. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everybody who came on board to listen to all or some. And I'll put this out as on my newsletter, and I'll add you as a contributor if you want to send out to your people too. And I look forward to having more discussions.
100%. Thanks so much for having me, Daniel. It was great to chat. Bye.